Welcome back to continue 5.3. So in 5.3b, we're going to continue this conversation about solving polynomial equations, finding all of the solutions. But today we're going to use a different method. Today we're going to do something called factoring by grouping. Okay, and when you use factoring by grouping, when you have a cubic that has 4 terms in it. Okay, that's going to be the key to knowing that you can use this particular method. All right, so you can see I have it all kind of stepped out for you step by step. That's going to be good when you go to do your own practice work. I'm not going to sit here and read it verbatim, but when you're doing practice work, I recommend having that out. So if you get confused at all about the strategies I'm using, then you can go back and you can reference why I'm taking the steps that I am. So factoring by grouping. So by inherent with its name, you're going to be making groups out of these. So what I would do very first, group the first two things together and group the second things together, okay? So you're going to make two groups, the first and the second. And what you're going to do is you're going to factor them independently, okay? So what I mean by that is look at this first group right here, okay? The one I'm doing in green. I can pull out an x squared from that group, right? And when I do that, I'm going to be left with an x minus 3. I'm going to do the next one in blue. So that blue group, I'm going to factor that independently. And I can pull a 4 out of that thing. And when I do that, I'm left with an x minus 3. Now that is going to be absolutely key in this process, okay? So in this process, you need to make sure that you have 2 of the same parentheses left when you go about doing this, okay? Because when you have that same parenthesis, the x minus 3, I'm going to factor that completely out front. Okay, so I'm going to pull those parentheses together because I have 2 of the same thing. I'm going to pull those out. And then what I have left, I have that x squared left and that plus 4 left. So it seems a little bit strange, but when you get in the habit of it, it's actually a really easy technique to use. You just have to know, group the first 2 things, group the last 2 things. When you get that same parenthesis pulls forward, and those leftovers make your second parenthesis. All right, and don't worry, I have a couple of examples we're going to go through, so you will get to see this time and time again. Now the real question though is, it is solving this thing. So factoring it is really only the first step. Now we need to be able to solve this thing. Well, that first piece is really easy. That x minus 3, what would make that 0? Well, hopefully you all recognize 3 would make that thing 0. Okay? Now, I've also gotten you in the habit of when things are more complicated like that one, what would make that thing equal to 0? Well, that might be a little bit harder for you to see. So I do want you to step through the work for me for getting that second piece equal to 0. Well, here, this is why we already reviewed solving by square rooting. Because if you subtract that 4 over, and you square root this, whenever you square root, you get the plus minus. Square rooting a negative means you get an imaginary number. So square root of 4 is 2, so you're going to get 2i. And those are your 3 solutions, 3, 2i, and negative 2i. So do make sure for these that you know that process and that you know when to include that I, okay? That's one of the little tips that I actually blanked out up top. So that's going to be a hint as you're going through this because you are going to have to remember the plus and minus every time you do this, and you're going to have to know when to use I. And you use I whenever you're square rooting a negative. So let's see this process again, okay? Because we need to make sure that you're comfortable with this before I send you off to do it on your own. So, factoring by grouping. Again, that means you're going to want to make your groups out of this, okay? And I'm going to look at those groups separately. So that first group that I'm looking at in green, so I can pull an x squared out of that. And when I do that, I have an x plus 2 left behind. That second grouping, again, I look at separately, and I can see that I can pull a 5 out of that. When I do, I'm left with x plus 2 again. Remember, that is the key. You need to make sure you're left with that same parenthesis twice. Okay, you absolutely need that same thing, because that being the same is how I'm pulling it together out front. So I'm pulling that x plus 2 out, okay? I'm pulling them out front together. And then the x squared plus 5 is left behind. Okay, and when I say left behind, I mean it forms that second parenthesis for you. So again, not difficult by any means. You just have to remember that process. You have to remember what you're doing. So remember, factoring is merely a tool here. Now we actually have to say what would make each of these pieces equal to 0. Again, that first one hopefully is like second nature to you. What would make that equal to 0? Well, when x is negative 2. That second piece, that second one is one of the little bit more complex ones. So I'm actually going to show that I want it equal to 0, and I'm going to step through that work. Okay, so remember, this is why we reviewed solving by square rooting, because that's going to be essential as you're working through these. Subtract the 5 over. I go to square root. Whenever I square root, I need the plus minus. I'm square rooting a negative, so no, I'm going to need I. And then the square root of 5 actually doesn't break down. It doesn't do anything. So you can actually just leave your answer like that. So there's two examples for you. So now why don't we flip over to the back side of your notes. So here are two other examples where there's a little new twist in the middle of this problem. Okay, so here, again, I want my parentheses. And here I'm going to show that I'm adding in between them. Okay, always add that in if there's a negative there in the middle. Always break it up like this. All right, and now let's take a look at what's going on. So that first one, again, hopefully you recognize pretty easily an x squared is pulling out of that first one. And so I have x plus 5. In the second one, all right, in the second one, if I just pull out a 3, notice what I have left, right? So I want to pull out more than just a 3. So I'm hoping you recognize pretty quickly here that what I really want to pull out in order to make these things match is actually a negative 3. Because when I pull the negative out with it, now it matches, okay? So if you're getting two parentheses that are exactly opposite of each other, what that means you should be doing is you should be pulling out a negative with it, okay? And now we go through the process just like we did before. So now that x plus 5, I'm going to factor that out front. And then what goes in my second parenthesis? Well, my leftovers. X squared and the minus 3. Once I'm done factoring, now I get to go back and I'm going to actually finish solving. What would make x plus 5 equal to 0? Again, I'm hoping it's like second nature to you. That would be a negative 5. When I'm looking at the next one, the x squared minus 3, again, that was a little bit more complicated, so I'm actually going to show my work of solving what would make that 0. Well, I'm going to add the 3 over and square root. Whenever you square root, you need plus or minus. I'm square rooting a positive, so this one, remember, it's not going to need that I, okay, because 3 is positive. However, square root of 3 can't simplify, so I'm just going to have to leave it like that. And if you notice, when we move on to the next one, so next one, again, I always, when I have my 4 terms, group them up like that, include the negative inside the parenthesis, so I just kind of put a plus there to show that I'm actually adding between those two. And now let's do what we've always done. That first one, notice an x squared pulls out of that. That's going to leave me with an x minus 6. And from that one, if I pull out an 8, notice I have something that is exactly opposite. So again, I'm hoping you recognize pretty quickly it's actually not just 8 that I want to pull out. It is a negative 8 that I want to pull out. That is how I get those parentheses to end up matching. Once you have those two matching parentheses, remember that is going to be factored out now in and of itself. So that x minus 6 is pulled out front, and then your second parenthesis is going to be the leftovers, x squared minus 8. So my factoring by grouping process is done now. So now the only thing I need to do is solve each of these pieces. What would make the x minus 6 equal to 0? Well, that would be 0 when x equals 6. What about the x squared minus 8? So remember that one, whenever it's more complex, always show your work. Show me setting it equal to 0. And now I'm going to add the 8 over. Let's square root it. Whenever I square root, I'm getting a plus or minus. Now I'm hoping you notice that 8 can actually break down. This is one that can simplify for me because it breaks down into 4 and 2. And again, the reason that helps me is because the square root of 4 is just the number 2. So remember also that you will be sometimes needing to simplify the radicals that you come across. So again, I'm hoping you see that this really isn't that painful of a process. It's just a practice and repetition to get good at what that process is. So why don't you scroll down to the bottom for me, write that summary for me, okay? Write a little bit about how you're going to remember what to do, how you can recognize when to use this process, anything like that that may benefit you. So take a moment and write that out for me, and then come back ready to do your practice work.